Hi everyone, it's Rand here speaking. Hope you're well today, guys. Welcome to my room. Today we're going to be continuing our exploration of the function of NI, introverted intuition, dominant function of INFJs and INTJs. And specifically, we're going to continue excavating this idea that for a long time in the West, NI has been associated with vision, and whether that's necessarily going to be always the case, whether it is, in other words, a kind of necessary truth that NI is associated with vision, or instead whether this is something that is the product of historical circumstance, the product of historical contingency, may change, will change. Before this, let me remind you that I have written the book, The Ecstatic Soul. It's available right there. It's an investigation of the INFJ personality, compact 130 pages of deep analysis of the INFJ type. If you're familiar with the basics of the INFJ type, cognitive functions and so on, and you want to go to the next level to get a deeper understanding of the kind of INFJ consciousness that exists, you should check out this book. All the links are available in the description box down below to all the Amazon websites. Paperback or ebook format, that's less than $10. If you have any question, just shoot and I'll be happy to answer you. Introverted intuition, arguably the most fascinating function of all the cognitive functions there are, really. When I say that it's fascinating, I don't mean that it's intrinsically more fascinating than other functions, but it seems that as a matter of fact, it exerts fascination over people. Perhaps more so over people who identify as types who do not possess this function, or maybe possess it in an inferior position or tertiary position. Now, what we typically associate NI with in the common understanding, in the current literature, is the possession of a particular vision. I explain in the Ecstatic Soul, particularly in chapter 3, which is entitled Vision and Vocation, that the sense in which INFJs and INTJs have a vision is not a sense in which we typically understand what this means. When we think of someone having a vision, and I'm repeating myself, I've said this in videos before, we think of someone as being basically a long-term planner, someone who has a long-term goal and organizes his life around that goal. For example, you could say that Elon Musk is someone who has a vision, because if you look at each and every one of his different companies, you can sense that he's looking at something like how to ensure humanity's survival in the future. Fighting against climate change with electric cars, exploring other planets, for future human colonies in case of overpopulation, managing the progress of AI. It's all related to that single idea. And so in a sense, you could say that Elon Musk has a vision. Interestingly though, whereas even a few years ago, it seemed to be a matter of consensus that Elon Musk was an INTJ and therefore NI dominant, it seems that the trend is now shifting, and has been shifting for about a year or two, but it's coming to a head where the consensus, maybe not a consensus, but the majority might be looking at Musk being a TI dominant, an INTP instead. So we have, in fact, in history and in contemporary society, loads of examples of individuals with a vision who are not NI dominant. So there's no real correlation between having a vision in the sense I defined and being an NI dominant. And yet, it's interesting to ask ourselves why we tend to think of, again, the user of introverted intuition as a dominant function, as a visionary. We often think of prophets. We often think of religious figures, maybe heads of cults. We think of philosophers who saw far ahead and who provided a blueprint for future generations. If you think of Plato, if you think of Nietzsche, if you think of Karl Marx, all these people were visionaries, at least insofar as they had such an influence that it seems in retrospect as if they had seen from their standpoint hundreds of years ahead into how society would move. But you could actually make the point that maybe what they did at the time was not, to showcase just how visionary they were, but how powerful their thought was, and insofar it was very powerful, how influential it became, so that it impacted society. And so it looked, in retrospect, as if these thinkers had predicted a lot of what would happen. But part of the reason things happened that way is precisely because they produced the thought. So maybe the real explanatory variable in the so-called vision of these thinkers and practitioners, politicians, and religious figures is more that they had powerful thought and capability to influence. Nevertheless, it remains very clear that NI is associated with the sense of sight as a privileging of this specific sense over all the other senses, which is interesting because obviously NI has nothing to do with the senses any more than SE has anything to do with the senses. Nevertheless, NI would have nothing to work with information-wise when it comes to detecting and pinpointing patterns to further analyze without the contribution of the senses. And in the previous video, I provided the hypothesis that NI becomes metaphorized as a function predicated on vision, on sight, not as a sense, as a sense organ, if you like, which smacks too much of the physical, of the material, but metaphorically speaking, as a kind of transcendental ability to view, to see. Because sense, and specifically sight within sense, is the least bodily of the senses, and so NI latched onto it as what it was least alienated from. But this would suggest that the sense of sight being associated with NI is only the product of, again, historical circumstance, and it is not written within the DNA of introverted intuition that it should be conceived in this way. And therefore, that our tendency to refer to NI users as having vision is something that we should take with a pinch of salt, given different historical circumstances, given which philosophers won the day in terms of debate and extended their influence through their writings. Maybe we would have come to associate NI with other senses, or maybe with no particular sense, and expressed our understanding and conceptualization of NI with a very different kind of vocabulary. And this is something that I want you to appreciate. I want you to appreciate this because usually when people reason about NI in terms of the metaphor of sight, being able to see things, to see through things, to see into the future, to read people's thoughts. If you think about, this supposed ability that NI users have of reading other people's thoughts, which is largely a myth, of course. Again, we're thinking of the sense of sight, aren't we? In order to read, we primarily need our eyes and our ability to see through. Now, this is the best way to misunderstand NI and to mistake everybody having a vision as an NI user and anyone not having a vision as not an NI dominant, whereas, it seems to me that 95% of INFJs and 95% of INTJs will not describe themselves as having a life that is dictated by one single vision. In chapter 3 of my book, I prefer the word prescience. Prescience is the advantage of not carrying within it this metaphorical preference for the sense of sight. Prescience is really the idea that you know something without really being able to explain why. And when something happens, you do feel as if you were able to foretell it, to predict it. But the most important aspect, at least so far as the INI dominance account is concerned, is again this difficulty the INI dominant experiences when it comes to justifying and explaining why they came to that conclusion, which may have turned out to be a very powerful prediction. It all has to do with the alienation of the NI dominant from extroverted gathering in the form of SE, which is inferior, and therefore the difficulty they experience in linking the gathering of information in the external world, which is the raw data of the processing of NI, and the pattern recognition of NI, which then allows them to come to terms with certain forms of predictions or pieces of knowledge that they've acquired. In other words, they're very aware of the knowledge that they manage to get to. Just knowing things is something that they really experience, but the raw material is something that they don't really know how they got to collect it in the first place, because basically the activity of doing the collecting was mostly unconscious, SE related. So prescience in this sense is much more adequate, cognitively adequate, and I think more adequate to the Jungian approach to the cognitive functions, even though, if we are to be completely honest with ourselves, Jung continues in the tradition of what I would call representationalism, where the sense of sight is the sense most metaphorized when it comes to philosophical accounts and analysis and psychological accounts and analysis. And in this respect, I just want to conclude by mentioning a thinker to whom I will be returning sooner or later. This thinker is called Martin Heidegger. He is an existentialist German philosopher from the first half of the 20th century mostly. Frequently typed ISTJ, but just as frequently or almost just as frequently typed as an INTJ. It's one of those cases where the community, a bit like with Elon Musk, started by just accepting as some part of weird consensus that he was an ISTJ type, but is slowly moving toward INTJ, and now predict that within 6 months or a year, the majority will essentially agree that Heidegger was an NI dominant. What's fascinating about the ISTJ vote for Martin Heidegger, as far as I'm concerned, is that it seems to me that it resulted precisely from the fact that if you look at Heidegger's writings, leaving aside the fact that he was, politically relatively conservative, and that he seemed at least to look to the past and his philosophy. I think part of the reason why he was seen as an ISTJ is because he spent a great deal of time trying to emphasize other senses than the sense of sight as important senses when it comes to the ability of the philosopher to hear what the world has to contribute and to write what Heidegger calls being's poem. And I think that because people have been so used, they become so used to reasoning about intuition in terms of the sense of sight. When you have a philosopher who starts saying you need to pay attention to the sound of the words, to the way the words were used and pronounced back at the time when they were first invented or practiced as part of everyday language, rather than having become just words in a dictionary or a jargon book. Pay attention to smell, pay attention to touch, pay attention to all about the world, about being that envelops your senses. In order to write being's poem, you need to be in touch with everything. And the sense of sight leads to logocentrism, to an obsession with the idea that everything can be explained according to an overarching scheme which would be able to represent everything in an ideal manner. I think that that's what led people to think that Heidegger was not an N user but an S user, whereas in fact what he was really trying to do was to push at that early stage in the history of at that early stage of the history, the transitional history of NI, from the obsession with sight to a current opening up to the possibility of metaphorizing according to other senses. Heidegger was trying to push the envelope here. He was trying to say there's not everything is to be explained. Not everything is to be represented via the metaphor of sight in philosophy, and more than anything, through the intuitions of NI. He was trying to expose the historicity of how the representations of NI were created and conceived throughout time, and to explode those boundaries to make for an open space. Now, I'll stop here. If you enjoyed this video and you would like to see more about the history of NI, drop a comment, a like, and consider subscribing, and I will see you very soon, guys. Bye-bye.